Hey guys, and welcome to our third episode of Beyond Reach podcast. Today I'm with Alexis Mammarello, and we're going to be talking to her about her sermon. And yeah, Alexis, you got to cast the vision for Reach. Easy work, right?
Oh yeah, sure. No, very much so. It's not.
Yeah, that sounds painful. I was like, oh, good luck. Power to you. But yeah, no, so you got to do that. How in the world did you even begin to what was your starting point?
Yeah, so actually that was really tough because I'm typically used to having the Lord really put something in my heart in a season where I'm going to be speaking, and it's either something that I'm going through or experiencing, or some passage that He's just really laid heavily on my life at that point. So I have a good starting point. I'm like, oh, you've clearly shown me this. This is something I'm passionate about. So when Jay had the idea for me to kick off Reach this semester with a sermon on our vision and our values, I was like, And it was the first time that I was stuck with a topic that I actually hadn't chosen for myself. And so it was really tough because Reach is something I'm super passionate about and I love it, but I had to balance my own individual feelings about Reach versus the passage that we were going to use. And I kind of felt like there was a lot of pressure too, because I wasn't just speaking on behalf of myself, but on behalf of the entire leadership team who has poured in their time and dedication into this ministry. And so finding the right passage, and things like that was tough, but we had the values already, which is reaching for Christ, reaching for people, and reaching for unity. And so I really got to build off of that. And it took a while to find a passage that I felt really exemplified that, because we talked a lot about John 17. The whole time I was like, I'm going to use John 17. It's going to be great. But at the prayer night, I read Acts 2, the end of Acts 2, and I just knew that was where I was going to head. So once I had that down, it was a lot easier.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I think my favorite part about how you preach is you're a history major.
Yes.
And so that definitely influences your preaching. So when you're preparing for that, what parts of that impacts the way you view it, or makes the message you're reading more impactful because of the context?
Oh, that's a good one actually. Yeah. So obviously I love history, but more importantly, I love church history, and that's what Acts is. It's literally just straight church history. And so being able to pull from Acts, which is a book that I studied a lot for my theology paper actually, was really cool in terms of that context, and really knowing the context and the history behind what was going on in the fellowship of believers, knowing that that's not a story passage, but a summary passage of the overall lifestyle of a believer at that time, allowed me to really see the depth of that passage, because it's only a few verses and it's looked over a lot. Because the focus in Acts 2 is Pentecost, it's tongues, it's the Holy Spirit entering into the believer. But there is this other aspect of what life really looked like for them at that time, and how that influenced the way that they really devoted themselves to the Lord and to each other was really beautiful. And so having the historical context and channeling that into the passage, and my favorite thing to do is to explain that too. So getting the opportunity to share that and allow everyone to get a glimpse of what that looks like was really cool. So it definitely influenced the passage as a whole, or the message as a whole.
Yeah, I was because that passage I've heard a lot of they sold their things and then they lived together, and you had us all cracking up because you're like, this does not mean communism, and you're like, this is the context for the not now. But yeah, I mean, you kind of talked about it then, but what would you say are the simple points that we can adopt, just the nature of it, not necessarily exactly what they did, but the nature of that?
Yeah, so the nature of fellowship is something I really talked a lot about in that sermon, boiling that down to the two words that really accumulate to make up fellowship, or what koinonia actually means, which is community and communion. And so taking those pieces, and even when I talked about priorities, in the sense that a lot of people focus, like I said in the sermon, on, oh, they're selling all of their things, they're living together. But it wasn't that. It was they were willing to sell their things if a believer needed it. Why? Because their priorities were each other. So it was a community in which they had their priorities straight. They prioritized God in teaching the Word and devoting themselves to the Word, but they also devoted themselves to each other. And that was really the whole point of the sermon and the whole point of the passage. And it was fun to break it down. It was fun to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but the simple point is it was a group of believers who were devoted to Christ first and devoted to people second, and that's what that's all about. And that's what Reach aims to do as well. And it has its benefits in terms of teaching the Word, the practicalities of being in ministry, learning that together. But in simple, it's devoting themselves to the Word and devoting themselves to each other.
Yeah, when you were talking about the communion component, you talked about how that's the spiritual aspect, and that that came with prayer. And I was wondering, how do we not become complacent with the prayer? So it sounds like the basic principles of what they did was something that we could do now. Of they put each other first and they put God first, and that prayer is an important component of it. But yeah, how do we continuously grow deeper in that? And then especially with each other, what does that look like daily to grow that prayer life?
Yeah, so one thing that has really grown my prayer life personally is I don't always do a great job of this, but when I'm at my best spiritually and emotionally, it's when I'm doing my thankfuls every morning. So I set time aside, which is something I actually picked up from Tori Bailey, who's one of the founders of Reach along with Barry, is she would just before she journaled her prayer, she would write thankfuls at the top of her page, and she would just write all the random things that she felt thankful for. And that really created a posture of gratitude throughout the rest of her day, and that's something that it's done for me in my own prayer life, but it also reminds me of the different gifts and blessings or even things that the Lord has placed in my life. So it keeps my prayer life fresh. It keeps my posture of gratitude fresh. Sometimes I'll just write, I'm thankful for trees today because I think they're pretty. And so it's an all-encompassing idea of that. But also I think being vulnerable with one another and seeking each other out in prayer is a really good way to not get complacent. And I heard someone, I don't remember who it was, who said this. It might have been a professor here actually, but he encouraged us to not ask people oh, how can I pray for you? But to ask a question how can I best pray for you? And so that's been something that I've tried to do, and the question I try to ask people, because it encourages people to really think about it and be oh, not just prayer, but how can I best pray for you? And it allows them to sometimes be vulnerable and share something that they're deeply struggling with or things like that, or what's pressing on their heart the most. And so I think really maintaining a rhythm of prayer in your life and throughout your day, but also seeking people out in prayer and being vulnerable enough to ask for prayer as well is a really good way to do that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's definitely it's easy to read it, and then it's okay, how do we practically apply this? And yeah, no, those are just some good ways to do so. I love too how you explained the Holy Spirit component in your message. You talked about how first he met individually, and then by him meeting them individually, that they then became a larger community and sought unity together. When you think about the Holy Spirit meeting individually, what stuck out the most to you during that process? And then how has the Holy Spirit spoke to you individually, through that sermon process and just being a leader of Reach?
Yeah, that's a good one. What really stuck out to me as I was going on and I was wanting to talk about reaching for individual people, and I actually was going to use Peter because Peter is my favorite disciple. I love Peter, and so I was I'm finally going to use Peter in a sermon. I can't wait. And there was just, which you guys should look into it if you can. There is such beauty in the fact that Peter was the one to deliver the gospel message in Acts 2, given his history and his past. There was a whole other section I could have gone into with, so it's just it's so interesting. But anyways, off topic. On topic is that as I was searching, I was just well, what am I going to use to talk about individual people? I just feel I'm missing something. And then the light bulb went off in my head as I was reading Acts 2 in Pentecost, and it says they all heard it in their own language. And I was like, what better way to talk about meeting individual people than that? Because that's even something we're passionate about at Reach, which is what I said in my sermon. It's just like, we could put religion majors up there and have them preach, but also there are people in all different aspects of Sioux's culture that love the Lord and have amazing, incredible things to say and can speak to their own individual's community. So why would we not provide that platform for them? Why would we not give them that opportunity and make sure to hold ourselves accountable to give them that opportunity? Because you see that with the Holy Spirit in Acts 2. I mean, he met them individually. He met them as individual nations, speaking to them in their own languages, which I think is beautiful. Yeah. So that just like popped out at me, and which I'm sure was a result of the Holy Spirit through that process. But we definitely rely a lot on the Holy Spirit, I think, when we're choosing speakers. Which is why it's cool that like that's the connection that I made in the sermon. But we really spend a lot of time praying over who we think should speak, what the semester will look like, and we've relied on the Holy Spirit a lot in that way. And you even see it because what's really cool is we've never had two speakers preach on the same thing, which is something like you would naturally worry about. Like you're not communicating with each speaker, like. Yeah. You don't give a heads up of what your message is about, so that we have like a schedule. We kind of just cross our fingers and hope that no one preaches on the same thing or cool, whatever, but it's never happened. And I really do think that's the Holy Spirit's influence, and I will say Reach is 100%, like we are beyond blessed when it comes to Reach. Like all the success, all of what we do, the decisions that we make, like to him, like it is all him, in the way that he has just so faithfully led us in the leadership team and been so faithful to people just coming and like wanting to be involved, faithful and volunteers and things like that. So you want to talk about the Holy Spirit being involved, I could talk about all day long. But
yeah, no, I love too that you mentioned in your sermon that like Reach is beautiful because we're growing together, that it's student led, so and I think that's so true. Like when I was giving the sermon, I was like, okay, so I'm not good at this, but it's like we get to figure that out, like that process. So it was just like that was such a highlight of when I was hearing you talk about it, because that creates unity in and of itself. So that was such a cool part. And then it's a cheesy last question, but do you have a quick or whatever story about Reach that's like sticks out in your brain or is your favorite?
Oh, my favorite story? That is so tough. I'm gonna have to think for a second because there's just so many. But also, like, it always happens when you ask that question, your mind goes blank and you're like, oh my goodness, what's the story? I'll tell one funny story and then one serious story. Honestly, the one story that I told in my sermon is one of my favorites, which is why it made it in there, is when Seth Blackburn preached his sermon. It was just so unbelievably stressful because you would see, he used a music stand for his laptop and it was flat, and so he put it on there, and slowly the whole time it's just like slowly falling, and everyone's watching it like slowly fall, and we're like, oh no, what are we gonna do? Like, does he know it's falling? Like, does someone step in and stop it? And just slowly, and it slips off and he catches it, but everyone like laughs and it's lighthearted. But the whole time the leadership team is texting, they're like, where's the table? And we're like, we don't know. It's like, well, is someone gonna go find a table? And so Barry's out searching for a table, like going downstairs trying to find one. And it starts happening again, and he puts it on there and it's just slowly falling. And we're just like, oh my goodness, we have to get this poor guy a table. And so we end up finally getting him one, and it all works out. But it was just, like, it was one of those moments where, like, everyone's just kind of laughing and, like, they're seeing it happen, but it was one of just those moments where it felt unified, where it was a very, like, stressful situation, but it really wasn't because no one really cared. Like, it didn't take away from what Seth was saying or make people nervous, like, oh no, like, this is going terrible. Like, people just laughed and were lighthearted about it and were joyful about it, and it was great. But I think my more serious favorite moment are just the moments that I get to watch people discover callings because of Reach. Because we've heard so many stories of people who volunteered on the worship team and like have felt called to do worship ministry. Or there was someone who spoke and was like, thank you guys so much for giving me the opportunity, who actually wasn't even on the schedule. He was like a last minute addition. And he was like, I have so much more clarity in my calling now. And it's moments like that are my favorite, to get to sit down and hear people tell me like, hey, I think I'm called to ministry now. And I'm like, that's so great. I'm so happy you're telling me, but like, I'm also like learning this together. So let's go on this journey together. Let's both learn how to be in ministry together. And just getting to provide opportunities, getting to see people step into leadership in completely new ways, where they might not have had the opportunity somewhere else. Like, it's just really cool, and it's my favorite thing about it.
That's perfect. Well, thank you, Alexis. And if you haven't, you should check out her sermon. And it's a beautiful vision of what Reach is and what Reach will be. So thank you for having us. And that is the end of the Reach podcast.